sponsors also need to step up and be bold in terms of how they develop their trial designs, how they approach rare disease development, and how they interact with the agency. Get in there, work with academia, work with the patient groups. If we approach it in that spirit, I think we have a very good chance of seeing more flexibility and more rare disease approvals going forward.
Hello, welcome to episode 25 of FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines, your host. As you know, we're the only independent, nonpartisan national forum dedicated to discussing FDA. I wanted to remind you, as I always do, that if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so today at fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net, and you'll get an email whenever we have a new episode. We have another episode coming up in our series with Scatton, and I know you don't want to miss that, and some other interesting episodes coming up over the next few weeks. I do want to start out with a little bit of self-promotion. Back in 1999, I was asked by the Food and Drug Law Institute to create a book called A Practical Guide to FDA Food and Drug Laws and Regulations. We are now in the 8th edition. It has just come out. It is available for order at fdli.org. That's fdli.org. It's a book that's used in a lot of law schools, in food and drug law courses, and also by a lot of companies and individuals who want a broad overview of FDA's laws and regulations. It's become a basic text, and that's why it's in its 8th edition. So again, fdli.org. In this episode, we're going to focus on rare diseases. We have two very, very experienced, very knowledgeable guests, but let me start out with some headlines. Just generally speaking, FDA has just released its congressional justification for the budget for fiscal year 2027. The budget request is $7.2 billion. More than half is from user fees, more than half. That's quite a percentage. It represents an overall increase of 3.3% above the fiscal year 2026 enacted level. It includes $3.3 billion in budget authority, which is a decrease of 1.4%. By that, I mean the amount that the Congress actually authorizes for FDA, and the rest is made up in user fees, for which there's a 7.7% increase. There are also a large number of legislative proposals, including on prescription drug advertising, generic drug, device and combination products, infant formula. A number of items involve foreign and domestic drug manufacturing. The very detailed document is available on FDA's website. So this is a very important document for anybody interested in FDA to see, and you will see especially the legislative proposals. Well, at some point, we'll go over them in our podcast. Now, from our pharma desk, FDA has backed proposals that are aimed to entice pharma companies to test and produce drugs domestically. This is obviously a priority that President Trump has discussed. There was an article in Stat that reported that the agency used President Trump's budget, the budget we just discussed, to propose policies aimed at encouraging more early-stage drug testing and pharmaceutical manufacturing in the U.S. The proposals include ideas that will make it easier to run early-stage trials domestically and to give generic drug manufacturers in the U.S. a competitive edge. You ought to access that article on Stat, but you'll take a look at the budget that I just mentioned, and you'll see some of those provisions as well. From the devices desk, FDA recently announced it's launching what it calls the Reducing Readmissions Through Device Innovation for the Home. It invites stakeholders to develop medical device solutions aimed at reducing hospital readmissions, that's readmissions, by enabling care in the home setting. That's quite an initiative on the part of FDA. It's part of a broader effort to encourage innovation in home-based healthcare delivery, particularly for high-risk or recently discharged patients. Well worth keeping an eye on, as some of us are aging and may need home healthcare at some point in the future. It's a very important initiative on the part of the agency. From the Foods Desk, FDA announced it is seeking public input on a potential market name change for 18 species of rockfish. There was a congressional directive to evaluate whether alternative names such as snapper should be allowed. This is not, I guess, particularly important in the broader scale of food regulation, but for people who eat in restaurants or who buy fish, it might be of interest, and that's the reason that we mention it. From the cosmetics desk, there's not much happening on the cosmetics front. There is a deadline coming up. On July 1st of this year, MoCRA requires that processors have to complete their first biennial FDA facility registration renewals. And it requires companies to review and update facility and product information through FDA's Cosmetics Direct portal. So if you're involved in cosmetics, you have to know July 1st, there is a deadline coming up. So now let's meet our guest for our rare disease discussion, Jeff Levitt, old friend of mine. I've known Jeff for decades. Jeff is now head of global regulatory law at Argenx. He's coming to us from Ghent, Belgium. He previously held senior legal and policy roles at DLA Piper, Pfizer, Wyeth Pharmaceuticals. He has chaired Pharma's Law Section Executive Committee on the Board of Directors of the Food and Drug Law Institute. I haven't seen Jeff for several years. So, Jeff, it's good to renew old acquaintances and to see that you're doing very, very well in Belgium. Welcome to FDA Watch, Jeff.
Thanks very much, Wayne. Good to be here.
Also with us is Frank Sazanowski, another old friend. Frank is a director at Hyman, Phelps and McNamara, HPM. In the rare disease world, there is no name more prominent than Frank Sazanowski. He's helped secure FDA approval for literally hundreds of new drugs, including more than 100 new molecular entities, mostly for serious and rare diseases. He's been involved in more than half of the drugs approved by the accelerated approval pathway outside of cancer. So, Frank, you've been on FDA Watch before. Welcome back. It's always good to see you and to welcome you.
Good to be here with you, Wayne, and with Jeff.
So let's get right to it. I'm going to ask Frank the first question. Plausible mechanism. It's a phrase that Dr. MoCRA has been talking about, that others at FDA have been talking about in the rare disease context. Frank, I'm going to start out with you and briefly summarize what it means, plausible mechanism, but more importantly, how significant is it in the real world of rare disease and orphan drug development? And is it really a shift in how FDA thinks about evidence for very small patient populations?
Yeah, that's a great question, Wayne, because I think it's one of the potentially very important changes in the FDA regulatory armamentarium. Let me first explain what it is. And plausible mechanism, when it was first announced in a New England Journal of Medicine sounding board article by the commissioner back in November, he laid it out as something that is a new path forward for therapies for rare diseases when the rare disease is of a genetic origin and when the target intervention is sufficiently upstream and you have a druggable target, so that therefore your need for confirmatory evidence that you're having benefit is reduced because it's a genetic disease and you're looking at an upstream effect, that's close to the pathogenesis of the disease. A good recent example of this would be they didn't apply plausible mechanism, but Denali just got approval for a drug to treat MPS II or Hunter syndrome at the end of March. And that's a drug that is providing the missing enzyme that is due to a genetic defect. And so that's a kind of case where plausible mechanism as a new pathway could have been applicable, and the FDA, in my estimation, could have and maybe should have applied plausible mechanism to have given it a full approval instead of just giving it a accelerated approval, because the data in that case showed that they had a reduction in one of the substrates that's built up due to the lack of the enzyme, and that is heparan sulfate in the cerebrospinal fluid. And so to me, the plausible mechanism pathway, Wayne, has the potential to do great good. But what has come out of the FDA so far? They came out, FDA, with a draft guidance on plausible mechanism. And both the original sounding board article in New England Journal and the draft guidance focus a lot on individual cases. The case they celebrate is baby KJ, an individual who had a genetic disease, and then there was a bespoke therapy that was created for that individual. And both the sounding board and the draft guidance talk a lot about gene editing or ASOs. But the case of Denali, for instance, I think shows that this pathway has tremendous potential to help more than just an individual or a handful of Americans here and there. What do I mean? All the replacement therapies, like Denali's therapy, when you're talking about replacing a protein that's missing because of a genetic defect, the plausible mechanism suggests that there might not be a need for a randomized controlled trial or another type of an adequate and well-controlled trial to prove the benefit, because it's almost a lock and key. You know, you have genetically a missing protein, and what are you doing? You're supplying the missing protein. There's not a lot of pharmacology involved. In fact, there's no pharmacology involved. So the plausible mechanism pathway that the commissioner announced in November, came out with a guidance document, has been very limited in what the FDA has said. And all of the world who's been trying to interpret it has been working through that very narrow prism. For instance, on April 21st, there was a NORD symposium on plausible mechanism, and they highlighted the baby KJ example, which is laudatory. It's a great example. But I have not heard yet FDA officials speak to the potential that they could do to help hundreds, thousands of Americans who have like lysosomal storage diseases like Hunter syndrome. And I did see in the trade press, Dr. Teresa Baracchio around April 14th or so was quoted as saying that this could go beyond gene editing and beyond ASOs and beyond bespoke therapies, because the principles that are being articulated have broader applicability. And I commend Teresa Baracchio, and if we can hear other senior FDA officials speak to a broader footprint for this new pathway, that I think would be very encouraging to the rare disease community.
So let me turn to Jeff and get Jeff your impression of what's going on with the plausible mechanism. What I hear Frank saying, I'll cautious optimism that but more needs to be done to actually implement it. Jeff, your views on the plausible mechanism framework.
Thanks, Wayne. I think Frank said it beautifully, and I should add, I will say I'm honored to be on the same virtual platform with Frank, because he is a major name in the rare disease world, and I take everything he says with great seriousness, and I agree completely. This is an example of an initiative with some very interesting principles for drug development, to expedite drug development, that could be applied much more broadly, potentially, to a larger set of rare diseases. I think what's also key here is, it is, in the broader perspective, I think the plausible mechanism pathway is part of an overall focus of current FDA leadership on expediting drug development and review by FDA, which includes things like the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program, the recently announced single trial approach, initiatives currently to streamline the IND process, expedite early stage clinical development, and on and on and on. So I think this is part and parcel of a shift in attitude that I think is extremely promising. And again, I'll echo Frank as saying there's a lot of potential here, but it needs to be implemented, made real, and to the extent possible, broadened out to a larger set of therapeutic areas and disease states within the rare disease world and maybe beyond.
So you're optimistic. I'm going to characterize both of you cautiously optimistic. We need to see some implementation of the commitments that this current FDA leadership has made, but they certainly seem to be saying the right things. There's certainly a commitment. Is that fair, Frank and Jeff? That what we're hearing is positive. What we need to see is implementation.
Yeah, Wayne, I'm honored, Jeff, to be on the platform with you. So thank you for joining. And it's great to be on this with you. But Wayne, Jeff said something about the new single default study standard that was also announced. And I just, while I'm cautiously optimistic about the plausible mechanism, that it has greater reach than the FDA has spoken about to date, but I'm hopeful that the FDA will see its broader applicability and it'll be able to do more good than what's been projected so far. But on the single study standard that Jeff mentioned, which is another big hallmark of Commissioner McCary's first year as being FDA commissioner, that I think overstated the potential. And by overstating the potential of that, I think it undermined its utility. What I mean by that is that when the commissioner announced a single study standard, if he had indeed said the single study standard is applicable now for all rare disease therapies, that from this day forward, we will never look for two adequate and well-controlled positive studies for a rare disease. We haven't, in fact, used that for the last 5-6 years to approve all the new chemical entities for rare diseases. There's never been one that was approved on the basis of 2 studies. So we might as well recognize the reality that one study for rare diseases is enough. One study with confirmatory evidence. And I think that would have electrified the rare disease community, the investment community, academics, the rare disease advocacy community. I think everybody would have applauded the FDA and Commissioner McCary for making that kind of announcement. But instead, the announcement was, we're now going to have a single study default standard for all therapies, which means for type 2 diabetes and hypertension and everything, Alzheimer's. And it kind of undermined, because then people were kind of quizzical, like, are they for real? Can the FDA really implement this? And so unlike the plausible mechanism pathway, which is, I think that these two are his greatest initiatives in his first year. In one case, the plausible mechanism, he kind of undersold it, in my opinion, that he hasn't shown how broadly applicable it could be to help thousands of Americans. And with the single study standard as the new default, he overstated it, oversold it, so that it basically had little impact on people's imagination or how they can design programs. So I thank Jeff for calling attention to that, because I think that's the other major kind of policy regulatory initiative that Commissioner McCary has announced. I think both of them have great potential, but it's a little bit like Goldilocks. In one case, it was too weak, the announcement on plausible mechanism, and the announcement on single studies was too strong. And I think in both cases, they need to find the Goldilocks moment where then they can achieve more constructive implementation.
Jeff, I want to ask a follow-up question here based on what both you and Frank are saying. Have you seen a fundamental change in the rare disease environment, so to speak, among manufacturers, among academic researchers, based on what the FDA is doing in terms of the single study, in terms of the plausible mechanism? That includes investment. Has there been any change in the way that the world of drug development sees what is going on in terms of orphan drug development?
It's a great question, Wayne. I'm going to give a sort of a bifurcated answer, if you will, because I think at the level of policy, I think there has been a continued forward motion in, and I think Frank said it very well with the single study announcement, for example, really good intent, right? A lot of programs in place, both in rare disease and broader disease areas that still affect rare disease, right? But you could list many examples in the rare disease area, right? You've got the Rare Disease Innovation Hub, you've got Rare Disease Evidentiary Principles, RDEP, you've got ARC, Accelerating Rare Disease Cures, you've got the RISE workshops, you have a division of rare diseases and medical genetics at FDA. So there's all these initiatives, and you look at these and you say, wow, FDA is really focused on rare disease. And I think that's true at the level of intent and policy. At the level of actual, approvals and the review divisions, I think it remains somewhat uneven. Frank cited a great example of the recent approval for Hunter's disease. That's an example. And there have been other examples. There was very recently a drug approved for a rare kidney condition based on a biomarker, based on a proteinuria biomarker. So there's examples of definite progress. But at the same time, there have been cases where flexibility has not been exercised, and there's been complete response letters and in effect rejections issued. So I think what I would say is that the reality on the ground is still catching up with the policy and intent that's being stated at the leadership level in the rare disease space.
I want to ask you both about the term regulatory flexibility. I think, if I recall correctly, I think it was about 2012, Frank, that you published an article on regulatory flexibility for rare diseases and for orphan drugs. I think it was about 2012, and got a great response from Janet Woodcock, who was head of CEDAR at the time, and it reinforced and sort of enabled us all to use the word regulatory flexibility and sort of know what we were talking about. Do you see current regulatory flexibility in rare diseases? Let me start out with Frank, with you, and then turn to Jeff.
Wayne, and thank you for calling out that 2012 paper. That was the kind of the stimulus for the FDA then, because I was calling on the FDA to recognize what it had been doing, which was laudatory over the decades. And I was calling it out and saying the FDA has been exercising regulatory flexibility with respect to rare disease therapies. They just haven't recognized it and haven't spoken to it with respect to different therapies. And so that enabled Janet Woodcock and other FDA leadership after that paper came out to embrace what they had done, which to embrace flexibility. And in terms of where we are today with it, there was just a petition that was sent to President Trump and Secretary Kennedy and Commissioner McCary on April 1st from the Rare Disease Biotech Investor Coalition, RDB. I have nothing to do with that group. I don't know who they are. But they sent it to, it was signed by hundreds of people, hundreds of organizations and rare disease patient advocacy groups and industry members. And the subject was restoring rare disease flexibility. That was the subject line to writing to President Trump. And so there is this concern, and it's reflected in what Jeff was saying, that there's figure 1 in that letter that went to the president and Kennedy and McCary. Figure 1 lists 8 therapies that have been, let's say, not been given rare disease flexibility. I'm involved in 5 of those 8. So I know those cases very well. So this organization who was citing them, I'd say they're spot on by saying these 8, which were cited, are examples of where what Jeff was talking about. The FDA action pales in comparison with the policy statements. Jeff didn't say it. He was much more diplomatic. Jeff said that it's waiting to mature. Their policy statements aren't ready to. But it's one thing to talk the talk, but it's another thing to walk the walk. And our brothers and sisters who are afflicted with rare diseases, they need more than talk. They need therapies, and therefore, all of the policy initiatives which we've talked about here, plausible mechanism and single study as a new default, they do have great potential. And the things that Jeff was talking about, the rare hub, the RDEP, the RISE meetings at the National Press Club, these are all beautiful, but they need to translate into action, into medicines, therapies for patients. And so I'm hopeful, because I'm an optimist, that Commissioner McCary will see that the words and the policies are nice, but they don't mean anything for our fellow Americans until they get translated into action in the form of FDA positive action on rare disease therapies.
Jeff, let me ask you about regulatory flexibility. You may recall Frank's article from 2012, and we've been using that term for some time. What's your take on what's going on with the concept of regulatory flexibility at FDA?
Thanks, Wayne. And I think Frank said it extremely well. I would add this. It may be sort of self-evident to those of us who work every day in the field, but it's worth mentioning what the specific challenges are with rare disease drug development. You often are at the outer boundaries of scientific knowledge about a condition. You may have not very good understanding of the natural history of the disease. It's very heterogeneous, even within the disease population, very difficult to diagnose sometimes. You obviously, by definition, it's a rare disease. You have some sample size challenges, right? So anyway, add all of this up. This is what drives the need for regulatory flexibility. And again, FDA has acknowledged, multiple times in guidance and elsewhere that particularly when you have unmet medical need in a rare disease, which is still true for most rare diseases, I think it would be fair to say, I think it's still true, that you're willing to accept a greater degree of risk. I'm not talking about safety risk to patients necessarily, but risk in terms of the evidence, the application, of the standard of evidence to the specific program in front of you.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back talking about orphan drugs and rare diseases with Frank and Jeff. And we're back. We're talking with Jeff Levitt and Frank Sazanowski about orphan drug development and rare diseases. Let me ask you, Jeff, what have been some of your recent experiences in terms of dealing with FDA on orphan drugs?
Well, thanks, Wayne. I mean, as a person who, within a company and on the front line, as it were, of the whole development and review process, my own perception is that FDA is trying very hard to balance all of the different complex factors that are in play here, including the importance of flexibility and the patient voice and the other factors that we talk about in rare disease, but at the same time exercising, a degree of caution. I mean, clearly, I think FDA has historically been and remains, very reluctant to allow unsafe or ineffective treatments to slip through. And so they're going to exercise on the side of caution. I do think that one of the areas that needs to be explored a bit more is the importance of confirmatory evidence. We've talked about moving the needle on approvals, let's say, a bit further back in the whole development and review process so that it places more importance on post-marketing confirmatory evidence. That's something I think the agency and others could be looking at. But I would have to say, on the whole, in our experience, despite I know there have been a lot of talk about staffing shortages and morale issues and departures and all the other things that are affecting FDA, and I certainly don't discount any of that. But our direct experience is that the agency professionals we deal with remain focused, dedicated, scientific, and professional on the whole.
Yeah, let me follow up with that. Over the years, and I go back with both of you many years on rare diseases. There's been a major effort to develop more natural histories, to focus more on real world evidence, to involve the patient community much. That's a lot of muches, but I think it's true. Much more aggressively. Jeff, let me start with you and then ask Frank. Do you think the FDA is doing a better job of translating these concepts into actual review decisions, or is there more to be done?
Well, I think there's definitely more to be done. As I said, I really do think they are trying, but I think that, look, this is a community effort, right? It's academia, it's industry, it's FDA, it's patient advocacy groups, it's others. We had a really productive forum earlier this year at the Reagan-Udall Foundation on developing more patient-centric endpoints in clinical trial design, for example, because you have a little bit of a dichotomy between endpoints that are easy to measure and replicable and all this, sort of thing that regulators like, but not always necessarily all that important to patients. And on the other hand, endpoints that are important to patients may be hard to translate into regulatorily friendly trial design. So this is an area that needs a huge amount of work. The report came out in March. I will plug it, Reagan-Udall Foundation report, with a number of very concrete recommendations of how to advance here. FDA was at the meeting. They were very engaged. And I believe there are people in the agency who are committed to doing this, but it's a big machine. And so it's going to take some more time and some more effort to keep it moving forward.
Frank, your views on that?
So thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Jeff. That, I agree entirely with Jeff that it's a big machine, the FDA. And so there's a lot of people who are dedicated, public health professionals who are doing great work. And Jeff was talking about confirmatory evidence, because to get a drug approved for a rare disease on the basis of a single positive study and confirmatory evidence means the FDA had to understand what confirmatory evidence is. And I think I helped on 3 of the first products that were approved on that standard. And they all showed some other type of confirmatory evidence. One was Skyclarys for Friedreich's ataxia. It was based upon natural history, which is a type of confirmatory evidence. Another one was Duvisat for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, which was based upon looking at a pharmacodynamic measure. And then Filsuvix for epidermolysa bullosa, EB. That one, Mary Tanhai, who's a current head of the Office of New Drugs, she was the one who actually overruled her subordinates in a formal dispute resolution and granted approval to that on the basis of other studies in partial thickness wounds, because EB is a particularly genetically driven kind of disease. And yet she looked at studies in things like burns, which are other type of wounds, and found that provided confirmatory evidence. So like Jeff said, the FDA is a huge machine, and it takes all of these players. Jeff or Wayne, one of you mentioned the recent approval of, you didn't name it, I'll name it, Travere's drug, sparsentan, for treating FSGS, kidney disease. And it was Dr. Elisa Thompson who kind of championed that approval for that rare disease, because the primary endpoint on the pivotal study for that failed. But what she determined was that the finding on a key secondary, proteinuria, was evidence enough, given that proteinuria is now known to really drive the disease and not not GFR, which was the primary endpoint. So she ignored the primary. So she had the regulatory, Wayne, you talked about flexibility. Perfect example of Dr. Thompson exercising regulatory flexibility, knowing the science now had leapfrogged, the data. It's like what Jeff said, when we deal with rare diseases, we don't even know what is the right endpoint. When that trial was started for FSGS, for sparsentan, it was thought that it's a kidney disease. So you should look at estimated glomerular filtration rate, EGFR. That was the primary. It was determined while that study was running through Dr. Thompson and other nephrologists that really proteinuria drives the disease, and it had a very good effect on proteinuria. So it's what Jeff was saying, Wayne, and what you were asking in terms of flexibility. How does this get implemented? It gets implemented by hundreds of FDA reviewers kind of adopting that concept and implementing it, seeing that there is science that can be applied, sometimes in defiance of what might be a failed trial. I mean, I just had a meeting with Dr. Tanhai earlier this month about asking her to approve a drug on the basis of ignoring kind of a finding on the primary endpoint, because the primary endpoint finding, I think, has good reason to be ignored and to look at other data. So I think what Jeff is saying, and I'm agreeing with, is that we have to rely upon the intelligence and the courage of FDA officials who are the decision makers and who are the reviewers to exercise flexibility in looking at rare disease therapies.
Yeah, and I think over the years, as you know, we've all been involved with orphan drugs for many decades, and it seems to me, and I'll ask you whether you agree, that the fundamental commitment to bringing more orphan drugs into the market exists at FDA. I think it's throughout the system. Janet Woodcock did a great job of bringing that into the culture of the Center for Drugs, and Peter Marks, of course, at CBER was committed to the same thing. I'm going to ask you both to take out as our final question here your crystal balls and look to the future. Are you both optimistic? Are we going to solve a lot of these problems? A lot of these problems are not unsolvable. They just need a lot of debate. They need a lot of discussion. And as biology moves forward, there need to be new standards that are established. Jeff, let me start with you. Crystal ball, are you optimistic about the future? And what do you think needs to be changed in order to make FDA even more comfortable approving more orphan drugs? And I'll ask Frank the same question as the final question here. Jeff?
Thanks, Wayne. Yes, I am optimistic. I'm actually reasonably confident that if the agency stays on its current policy course, as we were talking about earlier, and continues to rebuild its resources, then I think we have a very good chance of seeing more flexibility in practice. The thing I would add is, I don't think we should put it all on the FDA. This is, as I referred to earlier, it's a community effort. I mean, sponsors also need to step up and be bold in terms of how they develop their trial designs, how they approach rare disease development and how they interact with the agency on this. Take the agency at its word. We hear very frequently from FDA, come in and see us, talk to us early. As Frank knows very well, doesn't always work that way in practice due to resource issues, but take them at their word, get in there, work with academia, work with the patient groups. And I think if we approach it in that spirit, I think we have a very good chance of seeing more flexibility and more rare disease approvals going forward.
Frank, you get the final word here.
Well, thank you for the final word, Wayne and Jeff. I join Jeff. I'm very optimistic that going forward, I mean, I think that, let me say this, even though I've provided some, what I hope is constructive, critiques with respect to Commissioner McCary's two major initiatives, regulatory initiatives, plausible mechanism and the single study as a default standard. I think both of those, should be applauded because I hardly can recall another time in which an FDA commissioner has, without the prod of a public health crisis, announced such breathtakingly broad policy initiatives. For instance, when I sat at the table with Bob Temple in the commissioner's conference room, and Bob came up with the idea to address the AIDS crisis to come accelerated approval. And that was in response to a crisis. When the Congress in 1962 created the requirement to show benefit, it was in response to a crisis, thalidomide. It seems like big ideas come out of crisis, and yet the commissioner has boldly gone where I think no commissioner has gone before, which is on his own initiative, without being prodded. He has articulated at least these two very, very important, potentially important initiatives. So I'm hopeful that as he continues to work with the staff, with the people at the FDA who have more experience and understanding, like I mentioned Dr. Mary Tanhai, the head of the Office of New Drugs. I mentioned Teresa Baracchio, the head of the Office of Neuroscience. These people, if they can work more with the people who understand how to apply these things in their day-to-day work on therapies for rare diseases, I think that we could transform these kind of broad policy initiatives into actual practical systems that will actually accelerate the access to new therapies for our sisters and brothers in need. So I'm very optimistic, Wayne.
That's a great note to end this interview on. Let me thank Jeff and Frank. I do want to turn now to our resource link segment. We provide our listeners with some valuable links that they might want to check out. If you go to our website, fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net, you don't have to write anything down. You'll be able to access some of these articles and some of the things that I'm going to mention now. So a link to FDA's announcement about its new adverse event monitoring system. It's a unified, searchable platform that consolidates adverse event reports across drugs, biologics, vaccines, cosmetics, and other regulated products into a single dashboard. Frank just mentioned some of the initiatives that the current leadership of FDA has made. This is another new initiative. Previously, there's been a patchwork of multiple databases, so now FDA intends to consolidate that. If you go to fdawatch.net, our link takes you to FDA's page with more information and access to the system. Let me turn now to our pharmaceutical resource link. On June 4th, FDA will hold a public meeting to gather input into the National Priority Voucher Pilot Program. Very important program. That's another initiative. The meeting will allow all stakeholders to provide feedback on the program structure, implementation, and future direction. As we all know, there have been a number of vouchers that have already been issued. It's a very important initiative on the part of the current leadership of FDA. Go to fdawatch.net for more information. In the devices area, in late March, FDA issued final guidance on when and what methods to use to collect and submit patient preference information for a device. It describes when patient preference information may be useful, such as in assessing benefits and risks, and it provides recommendations on how to design studies that generate reliable scientific evidence. Very important initiative because increasingly FDA has been trying to rely more on patient preference. It's been a major trend over the years. It's hard to actually implement. Our link takes you to FDA's final guidance document in this area. In the foods area, the nonprofit Environmental Working Group recently launched an interactive map that serves as a state-by-state tracking tool that provides information about current legislation involving food chemicals across the U.S. It's a great resource, and I urge you to, again, go to fdawatch.net and that will take you to the interactive map and provide some really interesting information about what's going on across the country. Cosmetics area, the Independent Beauty Association will host its Cosmetics Convergence, Meet the Regulators, on May 21st at the Javits Center in New York City. It's a one-day event. It'll bring together federal and state regulators with cosmetics industry leaders to discuss compliance, policy, and regulatory developments. There hasn't been a whole lot of proactive activity at FDA about cosmetics, but obviously the implementation of MoCRA is on everybody's mind, and it's very important to continue those kinds of dialogue. So May 21st, Javits Center, New York, anybody interested in cosmetics. FDAWatch.net is the way to access all of this information. On that note, again, let me thank Jeff Levitt, Frank Sazanowski. This was really a good session today. I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin-Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. If you want to be a marketing partner, if you want to be a sponsor, if you want to just comment on the show, you can contact us at info.fdawatch.net, and I encourage you to do so. I want to encourage you, if you're so inclined, to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. It really does make a difference. And remember to follow us and subscribe. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines signing off. See you next time.